Welcome back to Creepshow, where we dive into the most spine-chilling tales from beyond the grave, uncovering the dark mysteries that haunt our world. Today, we're exploring some truly mind-bending stories. Stories of murder victims who, even after death, managed to solve their own cases. From ghostly visions to eerie messages and chilling final blog posts, these 10 cases prove that sometimes the dead don't stay silent. Grab your flashlight because you're about to hear about those who reached back from the other side, bringing justice and exposing killers who thought they'd gotten away. Number 10. The Ghost of Fred Fisher Shows the Way. Our first story takes us to 1826 in the town of Campbelltown, Australia. Frederick Fisher was a respected farmer, the kind of guy everyone in town knew. But one day, he vanished without a trace. His neighbor, George Worrell, was the last person to see Fred, and soon after, George started telling folks that Fred had left town suddenly, but not before signing his entire farm over to him. Strange, right? Months passed. Fred was still missing, and suspicion started to grow. But it wasn't until a local man named John Farley encountered something chilling that the pieces finally came together. Walking by a creek one night, John saw what he could only describe as an apparition. It was Fred. He was pale, bloodied, and pointing toward the creek. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he vanished. Now you can imagine the terror that John must have felt, but he knew what he'd seen, and he knew exactly where to look. With some help from the townsfolk, they began to dig around the area where Fred had pointed. There, in a shallow grave, they found Fred's body, battered and broken. Under pressure, George Worrell eventually confessed to the murder, and justice was served. They say Fred's ghost appeared to protect his legacy, and in the end, it was his own spirit that helped bring his killer to justice. Are you starting to feel the chills yet? Don't worry, because our next story is only going to get creepier. Number 9. Zona Heaster Shue sends a chilling warning from beyond. Our next story takes us back to 1897, to the small, snow-covered town of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Elva Zona Heaster Shue was a young woman full of life, newly married to a man named Edward Stribling Trout Shue. But one cold winter's day, Zona was found dead, and the local coroner listed her cause of death as everlasting faint. A strange and vague term even back then. To most, it seemed like just an unfortunate tragedy. But Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, felt differently. She knew something wasn't right. For days, she was haunted by a feeling that her daughter's death was no accident. And then, one night, Mary Jane's suspicions were confirmed. Zona appeared to her mother in a vision, more vivid than a dream, her ghostly form reaching across the veil of death to reveal the truth. Night after night, for 4 nights, Zona's ghost visited her mother, describing in terrifying detail how her husband, Edward, had ended her life. In her final visit, Zona's ghost even twisted her head completely around, demonstrating how he had snapped her neck in a fit of rage. Mary Jane, now certain of what had happened, went to the authorities, demanding a proper autopsy. And when they finally agreed, the results were chilling. Zona's neck was indeed broken, just as she'd shown her mother, the marks clear and unmistakable. With this evidence, Edward was arrested, and after a swift trial, he was found guilty of Zona's murder. Sentenced to life in prison, he didn't serve long, only 3 years, before succumbing to a mysterious illness himself. Zona's story is one of a mother's love. A love so powerful it pulled back the veil between life and death. Mary Jane Heaster never stopped seeking the truth, and because of her, Zona's spirit could finally rest. So, if you're feeling a chill, hold on, because the next tale will be even more unsettling. Number 8. Teresita Basa's spirit speaks through Remy Chua to name her killer. It's 1977 in Chicago. A bitterly cold night. February 21st, the fire department is racing to battle a raging blaze that's tearing through an apartment building. When they finally manage to bring the flames under control, they make a grim discovery beneath a charred mattress. The body of Teresita Basa, a 47-year-old respiratory therapist, brutally murdered. Despite the devastation of the fire, it hadn't been enough to hide the truth. She had been stabbed, and a butcher knife was still lodged in her chest. But with few clues and no leads, the police were left stumped, struggling to find her killer. Meanwhile, a strange event was unfolding across town. At the home of one of Teresita's former coworkers, Dr. Jose Chua, and his wife, Remy. One evening, Remy suddenly fell into a trance-like state, her voice changing, her mannerisms shifting. In a tone that was not her own, she began to tell a chilling story. Through Teresita's voice, she named her killer, Alan Showery, a man who worked with her at the hospital. She claimed that he had not only taken her life, but had also stolen pieces of her jewelry before leaving. Can you imagine the shock? Jose didn't know what to make of it, but he knew his wife, and he believed her. So, with a sense of urgency, he contacted the police and told them everything. At first, the authorities were skeptical, but with no other leads, they decided to investigate Alan Showery. And when they visited his apartment, they found a piece of Teresita's jewelry, sitting with his girlfriend. It was unmistakable. Alan was arrested, and after some pressure, he confessed to Teresita's murder. Whether Remy was truly channeling Teresita's spirit, or simply relaying a deep intuition, her otherworldly testimony is what finally brought Teresita's killer to justice. Sometimes the dead speak in ways we don't understand, and sometimes they speak just loud enough to be heard. Are you ready for the next case? Because it only gets darker from here. Number 7. The Golan Heights boy who confronted his murderer from a past life. Our next story takes us to the Golan Heights, an area filled with ancient secrets and deep-rooted mysteries. And it's here that a chilling tale of reincarnation unfolds. A 3-year-old boy living in a small village began speaking of something unusual. He claimed that he remembered a past life, one in which he'd been murdered by a blow to the head with an axe. Imagine hearing those words come from a toddler. He even had a long red birthmark on his head, right where he said he'd been struck. The boy's story quickly caught the attention of the village elders, who decided to listen. They followed him as he led them through the area, step by step, to a location he seemed to know all too well. And there, buried in the earth, they found skeletal remains. Then, shockingly, they found the murder weapon too, an old, rusty axe. The boy didn't stop there. He then pointed to a local man, claiming this was the man who had killed him in his past life. The man went pale, his face drained of color. He denied everything at first, but as word of the discovery spread and the pieces started to fall into place, he finally broke down and confessed to the murder. Chillingly, when they examined the skull of the remains, the wound lined up exactly with the boy's red birthmark. It's a story that forces us to question the nature of life, death, and what might come after. Are you feeling the chills yet? Because the next story will plunge us even deeper into the unknown. Number 6. Ashley Howley drags a psychic out of bed to reveal her own murder. Ashley Howley was only 20 years old, full of life, with dreams ahead of her. But all that was taken away by someone she trusted. Her ex-boyfriend, Robert P. McMichael II, a man with a dark and twisted mind. After she disappeared, the police had long suspected Robert was involved. They had nothing concrete, though, no body, no physical evidence, just a terrible feeling that he was guilty. They'd even searched around his father's property with cadaver dogs, but they found nothing, no scent, no clues. And so, Robert walked free, his secret hidden for nearly 4 years. But Ashley wasn't done. She was determined to make sure the truth came to light. One night, a psychic medium named Christy Robinette was fast asleep, unaware that she was about to be pulled into a nightmare. Ashley's spirit came to Christy in the dead of night, dragging her out of bed with a message, showing her flashes of what had happened and the terrible truth of where her body lay. Ashley described everything, the cement, the location, and even pointed to the property near her ex-boyfriend's father's house. Christy knew she had to go to the authorities with this vision, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. And this time, with the information Ashley's spirit had given, they searched again. Sure enough, they found Ashley's body, buried just as she'd described. Her ex-boyfriend Robert finally broke under the weight of the evidence and confessed not only to Ashley's murder, but to another brutal crime. He had also taken the lives of his own mother and her boyfriend. Ashley wasn't about to let her story go untold. Even in death, she sought justice, making sure her killer paid for what he had done. As you sit there in the dark, remember that sometimes justice finds a way, no matter the obstacles. And the next story? It will show you just how far the dead will go to be heard. Number 5. Catherine Ballesteros whispers her killer's name in the morgue. The brutal murder of Catherine Ballesteros left an entire community in shock. She was found stabbed 33 times. The scene was bloody, chaotic. Footprints covered the floor, belongings were missing, and traces of blood were found on the doorknob. The police hoped this blood might lead them to her killer, but they knew it was a long shot. They'd need a match, and that meant her killer would have to have a record. Yet, in this case, DNA wouldn't be the deciding factor. Instead, it was Catherine herself, still lingering, desperate to bring her killer to justice. In the morgue, Catherine's grieving parents stood over her body, grappling with an unimaginable loss. Her mother, Emmer, was inconsolable, her heart shattered. And then, something strange happened. Emmer heard a faint whisper, soft, yet unmistakable. It was a single word. Baba. The name jolted her out of her grief. She knew that Catherine's spirit was reaching out, guiding her to the truth. There was someone in the neighborhood, a man known by the nickname Baba. His real name was Ryan Vizcarra, and he was no stranger to the police. Known for his history of theft, he was immediately placed under suspicion. When the police ran his prints and matched his blood, it all came together. He was the one they were looking for. With the evidence in hand, they brought him to trial. Ryan Baba Vizcarra was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Catherine's spirit had pointed her mother in the right direction, ensuring her killer would never harm anyone else again. Sometimes, the dead reach out in whispers, guiding us toward the answers we need. The next story will show us just how powerful those whispers can be. Number 4. Maria Marten's ghost reveals the Red Barn murder. In 1828, in the quiet English countryside, Maria Marten's story came to a violent and tragic end. Maria had been involved with a man named William Corder, a man she thought she could trust. But William had other plans. Plans that ended with Maria's life cut short and her body hidden away. To cover his tracks, William forged a letter to Maria's family, claiming she'd eloped with him and was living a happy new life. At first, it seemed like an answer to Maria's sudden disappearance, and her family, though puzzled, accepted it. But Maria's stepmother, Anne, felt uneasy. Something didn't sit right with her. And then, the dreams started. Night after night, Anne was haunted by visions, terrible, vivid images of Maria being murdered, in a red barn. At first, she tried to brush them off, thinking it was just her imagination, but the dreams kept coming, each one more intense than the last. Anne could no longer ignore them. She begged her husband to go to the barn and check, convinced that Maria's spirit was trying to show her something. When he finally agreed and ventured to the barn, he found a horrifying sight. Maria's body was buried in a grain storage bin, wrapped in a sack. Around her neck was William's signature green handkerchief, a piece of unmistakable evidence tying him to the crime. William was swiftly brought to trial, and the case became known as the Red Barn Murder, infamous across the country. He was publicly hanged, his body dissected, and in a grim twist, his skin was tanned by a surgeon and used to bind a book containing the details of his crime. Maria's spirit wouldn't let her story go untold. Her dreams brought the truth to light and ensured that William paid for his brutal betrayal. As you let that story sink in, remember, sometimes the dead reach out in the most unexpected ways, desperate to reveal the truth. But the next story? It's even darker. So stay close. Number 3. Nadine Haag's Last Words expose a sinister truth. It was December 2009 in Sydney, Australia, when 33-year-old Nadine Haag was found dead in her apartment. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic suicide. She was found in the shower, her wrist deeply slashed, and beside her was a note, written in her own handwriting. But Nadine's family wasn't convinced. They'd long suspected her ex-boyfriend, Nastore Gizon, a man with a violent streak and someone she'd been battling in a tense custody fight. They believed he had a motive and the means to stage her death. The police, however, ruled it a suicide. Case closed. Or so they thought, but Nadine's family couldn't let it go. They dug deeper, examining every detail of her death. The cut on her wrist was disturbingly deep, almost to the bone. It didn't fit the typical profile of a self-inflicted wound. Even stranger, there were pills missing from a bottle, but toxicology reports showed nothing in her system. The evidence just didn't add up. And then there was a breakthrough. Behind the suicide note, hidden almost as if it were meant to be found, was a small scrap of paper with chilling words scribbled on it. He did it. The family took this as a sign, a final message from Nadine herself pointing to her ex. 3 years later, in 2013, a new set of tenants moved into Nadine's old apartment. While cleaning the bathroom, they made a horrifying discovery. Scratched into the tile were the same 3 words, "He did it." With this new revelation, the case was re-examined, and the coroner ultimately disagreed with the initial suicide ruling. Still, they lacked physical evidence to place Guizon in the apartment on that fateful day. The final pieces of the puzzle remained just out of reach, but Nadine's haunting message had revealed enough to cast doubt on the story her killer tried to write. Sometimes the truth lingers, even when it's buried. It finds a way to the surface, bringing light to the darkness. Our next story delves even deeper into that darkness. Number 2. Amarjit Chohan left a clue in his sock to expose his family's killers. In 2003, Amarjit Chohan and his entire family met a tragic and brutal end. Chohan, his wife, his 2 young children, and his mother-in-law were all murdered in a cold-blooded plot orchestrated by a man named Kenneth Reagan. Once the horrific crime was complete, Reagan and his accomplices, Bill Hornsey and Peter Reese, tried to eliminate every trace of evidence, dumping Chohan's body into the ocean, hoping it would never resurface. But what they hadn't counted on was that Amarjit had left a message of his own. You see, while Chohan had been held captive in Reagan's home, he'd come across a piece of mail, one bearing Reagan's address. Thinking fast, Chohan took the letter, folded it, and stuffed it into his sock. It was an act of quiet defiance, a way to reach for justice even when all hope seemed lost. When Chohan's body was eventually recovered, authorities were initially puzzled by the senseless tragedy. But when they found the note in his sock, like a message in a bottle, it was as if Chohan himself was reaching from beyond the grave, pointing the way to his killers. This single clue led investigators straight to Reagan's home, unraveling the plot and connecting Reagan, Hornsey, and Reese to the murder of not only Chohan, but his entire family. Each man faced justice, thanks to the bravery of a victim who refused to let his story be buried. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments, a single act of courage can bring the truth to light. As you hold on to that, prepare yourself, because our next and final story is one you won't soon forget. Number 1. A blogger's last post brings his killer to justice. This final story takes us into the digital age, where even a blog post can carry the weight of a final testimony. Simon Ung was an ordinary man living with his sister Sharon and chronicling his life online like so many do. But one day, his blog became much more than a simple journal. In his last post, he captured the events leading up to the horrifying murder of both himself and his sister by Sharon's ex-boyfriend, Jin Lin. It all began when Lin showed up at their apartment, claiming he just wanted to retrieve some fishing poles. Simon, feeling uneasy, started blogging about the strange turn of events. He wrote that Lin was already inside, pacing around, smoking, his shoes tracking dirt over a freshly washed floor. Simon was hoping it would end there, that Lin would take his things and leave. But what came next was more than he could have imagined. Minutes after that final post, Lin snapped. He attacked Simon, repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, tying him up, and ransacking the apartment. When Sharon returned home, she walked into the middle of a nightmare. Lin turned his rage on her, murdering her as well before returning to brutalize Simon one last time. It was this chilling post that helped the police unravel the events of that fateful day. With Simon's blog as evidence, they were able to place Lin at the scene and reconstruct what had happened. In 2008, Jin Lin was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that wraps up our countdown of murder victims who refused to rest until their killers were brought to justice. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, it's hard to deny the eerie evidence that brought these cases to a close. But the question remains, was it really the victims themselves reaching out, or was something else at work? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the unexplained, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Creepshow, and ring the bell icon so you don't miss our next tale from the shadows. Thanks for joining us tonight, and remember, sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and most of all, stay creepy.